Okay, so some questions that I have been seeing with some consistency give me a little concern that maybe what some of you are doing is you log in and then you don't pay attention. You go off and do whatever you do. I don't know what you're doing. And then at a certain time you come back and log off. And the reason that I think this are some of the questions that I've been getting. So just in case we need to clarify a couple things. You have a question, a weekly question. It's one over each chapter. It's probably ideal if you work on one a week, but then they're all due at the same time. And they're due on the 18th, which is next Friday. You also have a quiz, which is due on the 18th, which is next Friday, which is why I'm suggesting that you space stuff out so that you don't have to do it all at the same time, which will create a lot of pressure and tension and stress for you, and nobody needs that. So you may want to kind of look ahead, look at the due date, and make sure that you start some stuff now instead of waiting until it's all due. Also, I had some people, I graded some of the stuff that you guys have turned in. If you turned in stuff before yesterday, it should be graded now. And I'll put comments on there. And here's some things that I've noticed people saying. I don't have a textbook, so I'm having trouble answering this. I could see why. You're supposed to have a textbook. I'm sorry if you don't have one. I did put a link on there to a textbook. You should use that. Even you ordered a book, but it didn't come in yet, use the link to the textbook. I know the 5th edition one apparently went away. I didn't check, but I believe you. So, I don't know why you'd lie about that. So I'm sure you're right about that. So then someone else shared another link that you could use to download the book. You can download a PDF of the book, which may not be the best way to go about it, but it's way better than not having a book. And there's also a link where you can get 21 days free of the book, and you could do that until you figure out another way to get the book, or until you decide, yeah, I got to just download the thing. So you got to use a book. Those are the best ways I can think of to get you the book. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. There may be ways you can get one through the library. There are probably other things you can do. I don't know. Some people have rented them, half price books, you know how, well, I don't even know, is that even open? Amazon, the actual bookstore, where they would, and you can rent an online version as well too. So there are lots of things you can do. Also, I put a sample answer to a question in the Blackboard page on the course documents section, because somebody's comment after I graded theirs was, how are we supposed to know? There's supposed to be details in it. It's like, well, one, I tell you a lot. And two, I put a sample answer in there. So look at the sample answer and kind of make it like that. Also, that question for week 1, it has there's 4 or 5 parts of it, where I'll say be sure you talk about this. You might want to mention that. Mention those things. If you, if you don't put those things in, and I told you to put those things in, I might get distressed about it when I grade your paper. So, you gotta do what you're supposed to do. And somebody told me that I never said that it needs to be about a page long. That's what made me think you're just not listening. You just log in and then you go away or something, because I'm pretty sure I've said that every time we've had class. So I really think your answer should be about a page long. It definitely needs to be longer than the question. It's not longer than the question. And look, if you look on the syllabus, there's only 300 points in this class. Every point's going to be pretty precious. If you turn in an answer that's terrible and you had a week to work on one question, you're not going to get very many points. And, that's not going to be helpful to you. It's not, you can recover from doing that once. I'm not suggesting. that it's all over. If I gave you 6 points on your first one, it's not, you're fine. But you don't have that many points to give away. So be as thorough as you can, put in details, add dates when stuff happens. It's a history class, we like that stuff. And your answers need to be, quite frankly, a little more detailed than my lecture. Because my lecture is really an overview of the book, and the book has some details in it. So the details show me that you went and looked in the book for some stuff. If I just gave you all the answers in my notes and then you put them back, to me, then you didn't really learn anything. You just repeated what I told you. So, and I'm not asking for, you know what you're supposed to do. I'm telling you ahead of time what you need to put in there. So hopefully it's not too complicated. And next week also the quiz should be available. And I had somebody ask me like, will this be on the quiz? Will that be on the quiz? How do I know what's going to be on the quiz? Course documents page. There's a thing that says study these things for the quiz. That'll be a really good indication of what's going to be on the quiz. I'm really not trying to trick you. And then after that first quiz, I'll probably do a little survey to see if you want more questions. And I may even ask if you want more weekly questions. I don't know. Maybe you want 2 that are worth 5 points each. I don't know. But we'll talk about that stuff later. All right, so before we move on to the stuff for the lecture today, do you guys have any questions? And I'm definitely going to stop and take roll before you go, so try not to log off, because I'm sure I missed some of you. I'm tired. You guys tired? You guys even there? I'm going to have to be like a high school teacher and occasionally just make you show your face. I just feel like I need to. I got the thumbs up from Christian. Thank you. And somebody posted their dog picture. I like that. Dog picture is cute. I have no dog, but. All right, and a couple of you are showing your live face. Very nice. Good job, live face. All right, we'll go to the stuff now. Let's see. Somebody was asking me in the other class, can I redo stuff? It's like, oh my gosh, I love grading. So I really, oh, sorry, I thought somebody was at my door. That's frightening. Why is that frightening? I would, my plan is that you do stuff once. That's my plan. What I told them, I'll tell you as well. We get close to the end of the class and it looks like you're 2 points from passing. I would absolutely say like, hey, maybe you go back and redo that the question you got the lowest grade on. That's probably where we'll do the redo thing, because I just don't want to keep grading the same thing over and over until you get 10 out of 10. Yeah, and it was funny too, because the person that asked me this got 9 out of 10. It's like, yeah, can I redo it? It's like, no, you can't. I was like, you got 9 out of 10. What else do you want? And I know the answer is 10 out of 10. But no, I'd rather you didn't redo it. And if somebody emailed in their thing and said like, hey, if I send this in, is this good? And if you're doubting it, like if on the first question I gave you a 6, and you go like, oh, crap, 6, that's like 60%. It is, yes, it is. And that's not cool. Before you turn in your second one, if you want, you can just send it to me and say like, hey, I got a 6 last time. I'd like more than 6. Am I, headed in the right direction? I absolutely would give you some feedback on that. So, I mean, feel free to do that if you want. I know it may not be exactly what you want, but yeah, maybe. All right. So, and I'm not trying to be lazy. I'm really not. It's just I got 100 students and another job as well. So, times are tough, aren't they? All right. Anything else you want to ask? Weather's nice, isn't it? Don't you love the weather? I'm just trying to share the screen here. Sorry. All right, so the weekly question is about Native Americans. Crap, I closed it. But I'll open the lecture notes and we'll talk about those. and you guys can let me know if you have questions. Hopefully I can see sometimes I can see the questions when they show up. I open the windows too, and I'm hoping that my neighbor, who sometimes swears while he fixes his truck, doesn't do that. We'll see how it goes. All right, last class we didn't get through the politics section, but that's okay, I think. All right, so during this time period, people are starting to move west. And there's really three main reasons they're going west, which is farming, ranching, and mining. So we'll talk about those, and then we'll talk about Native Americans, which is the focus of your question for today. Also, we'll remind you, in the book, it talks about this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner. And the reason historians kind of like him is he's a historian who makes history, and that just doesn't happen very often. He analyzes I was going to say 1980, but it's probably 1890. Yes, it is. Census data, and notes that the frontier was essentially closed, that now we have people in every area of the country. There's nothing new to explore or take over, which certainly some Native Americans would disagree with that conclusion, because they were in the process of being explored and taken over. And it's going to make people start to worry that the United States would no longer be great. In case you're wondering, have we thought about that from time to time? I think we're always thinking about that as a country. What is it that makes the United States great? And are we just about to start the big slide down, the decline? Have we reached our middle ages and now things are going to be terrible? Are we going to be like France now? No offense if you're from France. I try not to tease them about that. When is it we start to decline? And during this era, they thought that our decline would start when we stopped adding new parts to our country, when the east to the west was all filled in. So what this will end up doing is make us start to focus on ways we can add to our country, even though there's no more land available in what will become the 48 states. They're not all made yet, but in that contiguous part of the United States. Because we really can't take over, we could take over Canada, but we'd really stop thinking about that by, 1830, I think we'd stop thinking that. Well, probably, honestly, the end of the War of 1812. Although it comes up a couple more times, and we have a couple of disputes along the border, the 54-40 or fight thing with Oregon in the 1840s, but we don't really have a realistic goal of taking over Canada. And honestly, nobody lives there and it's cold. We've taken over all of Mexico that we wanted to take over during this time period. It's like, that's the part we wanted because it's right next to us. And we figure we're big enough that that's all we can manage. And, so we'll have to start figuring out who else can we take over, or are there other ways that we can dominate people's countries without physically taking them over? And we'll become quite creative at that, which will, sorry, which will change people's, like other countries' opinions of the United States. During this time period, I don't even know if people had opinions of us. England and France did, of course, Spain did, there were countries that Mexico clearly did, Canada did. But, we weren't really on the world stage. This is the era where we become prominent in the world stage, and then we're going to start affecting other people's countries in pretty dramatically. All right, so discussion of the West as a safety valve too, like if it gets too crowded in the East, people can just go to the West, or if you're unhappy with the politics of your state in the East, then you can just move to the West. Like if you didn't like California, I know that's West, by the way, you could move to Texas, that sort of idea. If you didn't like New York, you could move to Florida, which apparently is happening as well. So the idea that there are no longer just empty places in the country where you can go if you don't like your place, how does that affect how we get along with each other? There's a whole lot of stuff going on in Turner's thesis, which gets us to start thinking about the West as a safety valve. What are we supposed to do to add new land? Is our country going to be great ever again? or, you know, is the decline about to start? So, and Native Americans, of course, we're just kind of hoping, I hope those folks don't come over here, but that ship had sailed or that wagon had been loaded or something. I don't know a good analogy for that, but here we go. All right, so the three main reasons people go to the West: farming, ranching, mining. So we'll talk about those. All right, farming, you know what that is. It's where you grow stuff. Now, you know, farming is different than, like, the only thing I can grow, I don't grow anything, weeds in the yard, that sort of thing. People give me house plants and they die. But farming is what, you know, you're growing a crop and you're going to sell it. And most of the farming in the Midwest and the West, the Great Plains, is grains. So wheat, W-H-E-A-T, and corn, pretty big crops, but also they're going to add soybean, alfalfa, that sort of stuff. And some of those are to feed people and some of those are to feed animals. And as the ranching industry grows, there's more to feed animals. All right. Now, to have enough land to have a really prosperous farm for that kind of farming, probably thousands of acres. What the US government was giving away was hundreds of acres. So that's useful. I mean, that's way better than not getting 160 acres for free, but 160 acres apparently not enough to have a profitable farm. So a bunch of people go west, get their 160 acres, about 2/3 of them not terribly successful, it's not their thing, so they sell their farms to the other people who then get larger, more successful farms. Almost everybody who moves to the West with the Homestead Act stays in the West. And if they didn't keep their 160 acres, then they probably moved to a small town, which was near where all the farms were, and started a business. Or maybe they became a teacher or something along those lines. So they kind of recreated Eastern civilization in the West. So if you're wondering, was this a good way for poor people to go west? I'm going to go with no. Because even though the land was free, the stuff you needed to get to the land, never free. So, and you know this, like if you've ever moved, there's always some expense that's not just about the moving, you know. You've got to have the moving truck, or you got to borrow all your friends' pickup trucks and buy them pizza. That wasn't an option back then. Or you have to have the provisions to make the super long trip during this time period. So think of that as the modern version of first and last month's rent and security, perhaps. I don't know. All right, so moving's too expensive for poor people. So the people who take advantage of this are probably what you would think of as middle class or kind of prosperous small farmers. Now, they're not the super wealthy dudes because, you know, those guys are staying in the East because everything's going well for them. And that's mostly true. Sometimes rich guys go like, I could be even richer if I moved to the West and did the same thing for a whole new group of people, create a new market. So yeah, there are going to be a handful of rich guys that go to the West, but mostly these are middle class kind of dudes. 2/3 of these homesteaders sell, so they sell their land, stay in the West. Successful farms are thousands of acres and are bonanza farms. So that type of farm is all the new modern equipment, and that's expensive. You probably can't pay cash for that. So you're gonna have to have good credit and you're gonna have to borrow money to pay that off. I think still, I don't really buy tractors and combines and reapers or harvesters or whatever farm equipment people buy now, but I think they cost like as much as my house. So you have to finance that stuff. It's expensive. Yeah, it's expensive to be a farmer. And that's why lots of farms in the modern era are corporate farms, but not yet. Okay. So you got to borrow money. You have to be good at finance. You have to understand credit. And you also really have to plan what you're going to grow, where you're going to grow it. It's also an era where lots of immigrants from Northern and Eastern Europe are going to go to the cold places in the United States, like Minnesota and maybe Montana a little bit, Michigan. So there's Canadian border kind of places, and they'll grow whatever you grew back in your old cold northern eastern European country, that winter wheat or something like that. So the good thing for them is they're used to the climate and they know what's going to grow there. So a variety of, you know, Norwegian, Swedish, German, cold European immigrant type people come to that area, excuse me, in addition to people from the eastern part of the United States. So this is also, it's going to create a little bit of conflict between guys who go to farm and guys who go to ranch, especially in the era of open range ranching. When the cows were done, the cattle were ready to be slaughtered, you would have to take them to the, you don't take them to the slaughterhouse, to the stockyards. I cannot think of stuff today. So you've got to get them to where they're going to be processed. So to get them to the stockyards, you had to take them on the open range. So they went on the long trip and you drove them. You had a big cattle drive. And they didn't have fencing during that time period. So they would go, cows don't know where the crops are. So they would trample farmers' crops. So this is going to create some conflict. And if you're wondering, like, silly farmers, why don't they just put a fence around their farm? Because there's no trees, so there's no wood. You'd have to import the wood, and it's super expensive. So that's why barbed wire is so important to ranchers and farmers, especially farmers. At first, they can put the wire around their farm, and then the ranchers can't go through their farm anymore. What eventually will happen is open range ranching will end, and the cattle just stay at home and hang out and get fat. And they either graze on the land, or the ranchers buy buy crops from the farmers to feed the cattle. So that benefits both groups. And then, by the time that happens, railroads are pretty well established in the West. So you can just put the cattle on the train and ship them to market. Or you get refrigerated cars and you don't even need to ship them to market. You can take care of that near your house and then put the little carcass of the cow, in the refrigerated car. All right. So farming, 160 acres basic plot, not big enough. Typically, successful farmers bought the homesteads of the less successful farmers, and typically everybody stayed in the West. This is also a family experience. So, dudes didn't just go out on their own. They usually had, wife and kids that went with them. And that's also why in farming communities, you see communities develop where they have churches and schools and stores and things that you have, little towns. Okay. All right, any farming questions you would like to ask? I would figure you would have millions of farming questions, but no. I couldn't answer any questions actually about farming. So, all right, ranching. You all should be experts at ranching because you live in Texas. So therefore, I'm sure you know everything about ranching. I know about as much about ranching as I do about farming, but I have, the historical perspective. So here we go. So ranching is more of a dude industry, so it's mostly guys. So families, maybe the ranch owner takes his family, but there's going to be fewer families that move west, and it's mostly men. Same kind of deal here. The government's giving away about 160 acres. And what ranchers would do is typically get their ranch hands to go and apply for more land and then consolidate that into a large ranch. So lands given away or sold for very low fees, sort of like farming. In some instances, it's given away as long as you promise to irrigate it, which could be something as simple as dumping a bucket of water onto it. So 160 acres also not enough for the ranching, so we talked about that. Less successful ranchers will sell more successful, or more successful will get their ranch hands to go to sign up for land. Pretty common for people of color to work on ranches, so you've got Black and Hispanic, or primarily people of Mexican heritage, working on ranches in the West. And if you're wondering why, well, Reason number one, big part of the West used to be Mexico. So Mexican American dudes, you know, a generation ago were Mexican dudes, and their land changed. I mean, they didn't move. Who owned their land moved, or who governed their land moved. So they're already there. They were already ranching. And if you're wondering why are black guys going to the West to work on ranches, I don't know, because things aren't going well in the South and things aren't going well in the North. That's part of it. The other part is there's a handful of I mean, it's a small percentage of the population, but it's thousands of African American men are working, well, they're in the military. So they tend to get stationed in the West near Native American reservations. So when their term of service ends, ends, or enlistment ends, they're already in the West. So it's like, yeah, I already ride a horse. I've got the basic skills, rancher, I can do that. So excuse me. So it's pretty typical for your ranch hands to be Black or Hispanic men, and it's probably a pretty diverse mixture of folks there. And if there's less discrimination just kind of by the nature of the job, I'm not going to suggest to you that people in the West are more naturally open-minded. I have no idea. Maybe they are. You're also going to see women get to vote sooner in the West than in the East. And I think all of that's kind of for the same reason, because the population's smaller and you all need each other's work, you know. So if they're, black rancher, ranch hand, a white ranch hand, and a Hispanic ranch hand, and you got a job to do, you're not going to say, well, I'm not working with those guys because there's 3 of you and you've got a job to do. If you're the family that moved over to the West and your wife helped you literally physically build the house and build the fence and that kind of stuff, when all that's done and you establish your government, you're not going to say she's weak, I'm not going to let her vote because she helped you build the house and she's probably buff and will get mad at you and punch you or something. I'm exaggerating there, of course, I'm sure. But because there was equality of work for all of these groups, for men and women, for men of color, there's more likely to be equality of certain opportunities. I'm, again, not even going to come close to suggesting that there's great equality in the West. I think there's just more hints of it. You'll notice along the West Coast, if you're Asian, there's no hint of equality. I mean, that's just a thing. And that's going to happen more in cities, especially in California, maybe Washington, California. There are issues there, but we'll talk about that later. So ranch hands, non-white dudes, less discrimination, dangerous working conditions, no doubt, low pay, probably not as rowdy as you might see them depicted in literature and film, because the jobs are hard, jobs are dangerous. You got to be sober for a dangerous job. Now, once the cattle have been sold and have gone to market, there's probably some festive times there, but those are short-lived, and then you go back to the ranch and you start over again. So things will improve with the invention of barbed wire, end of the open range, so that takes some of the danger out of this. And the biggest conflict in this profession, probably are cattle and sheep ranchers who fight with each other over grazing land. And what I have read, I not experienced this, so just read this, is that when sheep graze, they eat the grass, but they also pull up the roots, so the grass doesn't grow back. When cattle graze, they just eat the grass. So if there was shared grazing land, in the open range era, and there was shared grazing land between the cattle and sheep ranchers, then the cattle ranchers would sometimes actually shoot at the sheep ranchers because they just didn't want them there because it destroyed the grazing land, the sheep grazing. Okay. That's primarily an issue in West Texas and Eastern New Mexico. And like I went to college, my undergrad degree, the bachelor's degree, was from Angelo State University. Yes, the Mecca of knowledge. and they had a lot of ranching programs there and called themselves the sheep capital of the world, although I don't really think that they were. I don't know. But there were a lot of sheep there, and people there seemed to know much more about sheep than I did. And I did not major in knowing about sheep, you know, any sort of animal husbandry or agriculture. So I don't know much about sheep. Sorry. All right. And apparently the sheep also like eastern New Mexico. It's a good climate for sheep, apparently. All right. And then mining. You know what mining is. You know, you go and look for metals of some sort, gold and when we're talking mining here, it's primarily gold and silver. It could be lead, it could be some other stuff, but it's primarily gold and silver. And you already know probably the big gold mining place is California, and that they find a lot of gold in Sutter's Mill, which is near San Francisco in 1848. And then word gets out and a whole bunch of people move there in 1849, and they're called the 49ers. And then eventually there'll be a football team that will help you remember the 49ers. Colorado silver rush primarily, there's some gold there, but it's primarily silver, is 59. So they talk about the 59ers, and there's some sports team called the 59ers, but I think it's the lower level baseball team or something. I don't remember. I just remember seeing that and thinking, yeah, that makes sense. And then the Black Hills, it's primarily gold. And that's going to be in the middle of, or I don't know the middle, but it's part of a Native American reservation, Lakota Sioux. And the Klondike region will be a gold rush, and that's late. I think that's in, I don't know why I want to say it's the 1890s, but that's later than these others. So, and Klondike is in Alaska. And so that's going to, I think about 50,000 people go. It seems like that's what I read. But millions of people go to California and Colorado to look for gold and silver. And California becomes a state, you know, in large part when it does because of the gold rush. Because when they apply for statehood, they've got, you know, I think 50,000 people. And by the time they achieve statehood, they have over 1 million. And that's 6 months. Happens really fast. Yeah. Like Austin. No, it's not like Austin at all. It's not fast. All right. And Black Hills, North Dakota, that gold rush is going to lead to wars with Native Americans. All right. Lots of immigrants and migrants will go to or go through or go to Native American held lands in the Northwest, which will lead to some conflict. And the US government certainly anticipated this conflict. They kind of counted on it. So what they're hoping to do is to get Native Americans to live in smaller areas and to be more contained. There's no reason for that to happen if nobody lives in the West. So encouraging people to move to the West is going to improve the chances for the United States government to get Native Americans onto reservations and to force them to stay on those reservations. All right, I'll stop sharing for a minute. All right, do you guys have any questions about the farming, ranching, mining segment of today's lecture? Of course, we're going to talk more about the other stuff related to Native Americans, but do you have any questions at this moment about any of that stuff?
How did the mining and ranching and farming affect the Native Americans' land? Like, were they pushed aside for that?
Yeah, it brings millions of people to the West, so that ends up kind of, it makes it more important for Native Americans to actually have to stay on their reservations. So kind of the way it works is we start to develop reservations and we have military bases near those. And part of the goal of those bases is you have the soldiers there to keep Native Americans on their land. Native Americans don't really need to stay unless somebody's complaining about them if nobody lives in the West, there's no one to complain. That's part of what's going on. There's a lot of other stuff going on. But, you know, in some places, there's just really so much land. Like even today, I think you could have 5 tribes and, you know, 100,000 white dudes in that spot in West Texas between San Angelo and Lubbock, and I'm not sure anyone would notice. But, you know, it kind of depended on where everybody was. In California, you know, near San Francisco, you would notice. So the government's trying to encourage white settlers to go west, to really force Native Americans to stay on reservations, to keep them confined, and also to, and we'll talk about this as we talk about the Dawes Act, to set an example for Native Americans of superior cultural options. Because the goal of the US government during this era is to make Native Americans behave more like the average white guy. And the reason they wanted them to do that is because being the average white guy, in their view, was better than being a Native American. So, got to change their culture to improve them, which certainly is unlikely to be the way we would see things in the modern era, but was definitely the way they saw things in that era. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for asking. All right, anybody else want to ask anything? No, she'll give a really long answer. All right, there's going to be a day where I just force you all to ask a question, I think. It'd be fun. You guys would like that, I'm sure. All right. Let's talk about the weekly question then. Weekly question. All right. Weekly question. Here we go. So, weekly question. Discuss the experiences of Native Americans in the Gilded Age. Be sure to include the Dawes Act in this discussion. How does the emergence of the ghost dance reflect the experiences of the Indians? What was the significance of Wounded Knee? That's a lot of stuff. Okay, so Native Americans in the Gilded Age, I mean, you know, it's going to be hard for you anytime ever to say that this was a really good era for Native Americans, because mostly it goes poorly for Native Americans. So, you know, this is not going to be one of those questions where you have a balanced discussion of successes and failures for Native Americans in the Gilded Age. This is, and it's not even about success and failure, I suppose. It's like good and bad experiences. They're mostly bad. But definitely talk about the things I ask you to talk about here. The Dawes Act, which we'll talk about in some depth here in a minute, and what the ghost dance was. Be sure and describe that. And then what happened at Wounded Knee. I think I would also, even though I didn't include all the dates in my notes in your answer, I would put the dates in. So when you talk about the Dawes Act, in parentheses, put 1887. Or, and I don't remember the date for Wounded Knee. I think it's 1890, but I don't know why I think that. But make sure, you know, put that in there, even though I didn't put it in the question. But it'll just kind of help show chronology as you go through. And when you talk about the ghost dance, describe what it was and why Native Americans did it. And I don't mean you have to describe how they danced, just what the purpose of it was. All right. So we will talk about those things now, potentially. I think we will. Do you have to read the chapter? Yeah, you know, I really would read the chapter. I know that we've probably talked about this before, but the reason I'd read the whole chapter is it kind of shows you how everything fits in context, which is going to make your answers better. And for my purposes, for your purposes, it makes your answers better. For my purposes, as somebody who wishes everyone knew more about history, it really helps set the context of all the stuff that's going on during that time period. So not just about Native Americans, it's also about, you know, what happened to African Americans at a similar time, What are we doing to expand the military at the same time? How's our economy changing? So it gives you a really full picture of what's going on, so that what's going on with Native Americans isn't isolated. It might make more sense in the big picture. So I would read the whole chapter, but I would also, when I got to those sections about Native American stuff, that's where I would take my, my more serious note. Also, because people were asking this in emails and stuff, points for the class, what your grade is like. Now, if you look at the syllabus, which we did the first day, but you may need to look at again, there's a section where it talks about your grades. There's 300 points total for this class. All of your grades are already lined out in the syllabus. So like the first unit has a quiz worth 40 points and 3 weekly questions worth 10 points each. So you have 70 points for this first unit, and all of those things are due on Friday. So you'll want to make sure that you study the things that it says in the course documents section to study for the quiz, so you can get as many of those 40 points as possible, and that you answer the weekly questions as specifically as you can, with detail, add some dates, explain some stuff, and make sure your answer is longer than the question. I'm recommending to people about a page long, and if it's well organized and well written, bonus to you. That's helpful as well. But I think you should read the whole chapter. I do, because it helps set a context. Plus, they're only like 30 pages. So if you read, 5-10 pages a day, you can do one a week. It's not so bad. I do think if you're not used to reading textbooks, you probably don't want to read the whole chapter at once, because it might drive you a little nutty. And, if you're new at this college thing, all your professors, or most of your professors, are probably going to want you to read. It's a little different. I taught high school for 100 years, and I taught an AP class where I really hoped people would read, and sometimes they did. But I know it's easy just to look stuff up online. I know that it is. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. I'm going to turn it over. Sorry. But yeah, I'd read the whole chapter to set the context, but definitely know what it is you're looking for your questions and your quiz ahead of time. And since you have all that information already, I'd have that handy while you read. Okay. I know, for me, reading wasn't torture, so I always read. Yeah. And because I read, I didn't usually have to study. But, we're all different. Yeah. All right, back to the notes. Yeah. Unless you have more questions. If you do, I'll try to notice. If I don't, turn on your microphone and go like, hey, question. Or do whatever you do to get people's attention. Okay, so Native Americans. All right, so I guess our first kind of general, how do we talk about Native Americans discussion? Are there proper terms and improper terms for Native Americans, that will be offensive? Yeah, there are, but as a rule, and this sometimes is tricky because it does change, and sometimes changes, fairly quickly. It's probably changed, half a dozen times since I've started teaching, but Native Americans, that always seems to work. We know who you're talking about. If you say American Indian, that apparently is not terribly offensive and fairly descriptive, so we know who you're talking about. Indian, if you're talking about that in this context, on this question, I know who you're talking about. If you just talk about that in general, sometimes people will confuse that with people from India. So, it depends on the context, I suppose, but I don't think any of those things are considered, or, if you call somebody in your writing Native American, American Indian, or Indian, I think that they all work in context. Yeah. There are other, more offensive terms, but I can't imagine that anybody would use them in an academic setting. So, all right, so Native Americans or American Indians. Plains Indians, there's, I don't know, probably 80, 100 different tribes, probably more, who live in the Great Plains area, which is essentially the middle of the country, you know, over to a little bit farther west. Um, they tended to be hunter-gatherer type Native Americans, so they're not as likely, with some exception of Southwestern Indians who probably did plant, what are their three? The three sisters is what they call them, corn, squash, and beans. So they tended to be planter, harvester, you know, harvesting kind of folks. And in the Northeast, you know, there's probably some fishing and gathering kind of thing going on. But anyway, so these are hunter-gatherer, and the hunting is buffalo. Not that they didn't hunt the deer and stuff like that, but buffalo were the main thing that they hunted. So this tended to make them nomadic. You know, they roamed during hunting season. They went where the buffalo did because, you know, that's how you get the buffalo. They don't come to you, I suppose. So at least I've never seen that. I've never actually seen a buffalo in person, so I wouldn't know, I suppose. But there were herds that went across the Great Plains. The government really thought that this was bad for a variety of reasons. One, it was clear that Native Americans were culturally inferior to white people, and the reason it was clear is because white people were able to defeat them in wars. So if you could beat somebody, they are clearly inferior in pretty much every meaningful way. So if you want to help the Native Americans, you got to make them more like white people. And you see a bunch of white people run after buffalo and hunting them? No. So to change Native American culture, you have to improve Native American culture. The first step probably is getting rid of the buffalo. So that's one of the early things that the US government plans to do. And they plan to do that by killing the buffalo. And they're going to be fairly successful at that. Now, if you had one of those nice 8th grade teachers who gave you the little chart of all the things Native Americans used buffalo for, you noticed that they literally used every part of the buffalo for something. And of course, they didn't see a herd and go like, we got to kill them all. You know, that they hunted what they needed and, you know, understood that if they wanted to hunt next year, they couldn't kill all the buffalo this year. So, you know, they had to be good at environmental management, if you want to think of it that way, because that was their survival. You know, they lived on the land and they lived from the products of the land, and they had to make sure that the products of the land would be there when they needed them next year. So when they killed a buffalo, they didn't waste any of it. And they didn't just randomly kill buffalo for sport as a rule. I'm not saying that they didn't take the buffalo head and do something cool with it to show off, but I am saying they didn't kill all the buffalo just so they could do it. But anyway, the US government is going to pay hunters to come to the west to kill the buffalo. They will also ask the military stationed there to kill as many buffalo as possible. They will sponsor hunting trips on trains through this region to kill the buffalo, and you just shoot the buffalo from your train car, and then the army will just go and make piles of buffalo. So they didn't even necessarily use the buffalo. Their goal really was to eliminate buffalo herds. And by the 1880s, by the time of the Dawes Act, for sure, the buffalo herds were pretty much gone. And even to the point when we started to declare endangered species, buffalo, or I guess technically American bison, were listed on that, were on that list. They're not anymore because apparently there's literally, you know, thousands and thousands of them. But they all live in Montana or Yellowstone or something. I don't know. They're not here, but there's some of them here. But anyway, so the U.S. government plans to kill the buffalo, and they're fairly successful at that. Now, if you're wondering why start with the buffalo, I hope I made it clear. It's because during hunting season, that's what made the Native American men nomadic. If there's no buffalo, there's no reason for them to leave the reservation anymore. So what are you going to do for a living, if you don't leave the reservation anymore, you're going to become a farmer. So on the reservation, the U.S. government encouraged Native Americans to become farmers. So they did. And so here's how they went about it. On the reservation, they had the place where everybody lived. And then the rest of the reservation was the place where you farmed. And you all farmed together. So the whole tribe would work on the one big farm. And then the US government said, no, no, that's not how we do it here in the United States. We don't do stuff together as a big community and share in the proceeds. That sounds like something completely different. We don't do that. That's communal, or maybe eventually communist. And we certainly don't do that kind of stuff. So instead, what you need to do is farm with your family. So that's where we get the Dawes Act. It's not the whole reason for the Dawes Act, but it's a big part of the reason for the Dawes Act. So, Dawes Act. Okay, so, oh, and I didn't mean to skip over the Battle of Little Bighorn, but let me talk about that really quick and then the Dawes Act. So sorry, apologies. So Battle of Little Bighorn is going to be really the major victory for Native Americans during this era. And this is in the near the Black Hills of the Dakotas. And this is traditional Lakota Sioux. No, it's maybe Hunkpapa Sioux, but anyway, it's some tribal Sioux area where I think it's Hunkpapa Sioux, because I think Sitting Bull was, yeah, he was. Okay, you're going like, I don't care, I'm sorry. Okay, so the Sioux in this region, this was their traditional hunting grounds and burial grounds where gold was discovered, and it was on their reservation, so you couldn't say like, hey, you can't go there. But a bunch of people started moving in. It's also why Custer asked to be stationed where he was. Oh, by the way, I wanted to sort of point this out. This word is, that word is Sioux, S-I-O-U-X, which is a sign to you that French people must have lived near these tribes at some point. And that is correct, because at some point, these tribes were near the Mississippi River, and a lot of the French settlements were in Canada and along the Mississippi River. So the sort of anglicized name for the tribe was Sioux, and that came from the French, which I know isn't exactly English, but okay. But anyway. Oh, and when you read about Chief Joseph in your book, his tribe's Nez Perce, which is Pierce nose, which is also, from the French. But anyway, okay. So you've got the Sioux who aren't excited about people infiltrating their traditional hunting lands and sacred tribal lands. So Custer asked to get stationed there because he wants to, regain his rank in the military. He'd gotten demoted. No, he didn't do anything wrong, but, the Army was big during the Civil War. And then once the Army downsizes, they don't need as many colonels and generals and that sort of stuff. So he got demoted. It was kind of, he was the last promoted, first demoted, I suppose. So he wants to rise in stature and also maybe get a little gold while he's there. So he wants to gain some fame, and he does, but not the way he intended. And the Sioux had gotten off their reservation and gone to the Little Bighorn River, and they're trying to draw the Army in because they've planned an ambush for them. Custer, he knows that he's going to be outnumbered if he goes without the other divisions that he's stationed with, but he also wants to gain fame for himself. So he goes without them, assuming he'll be outnumbered by Sitting Bull and Rain in the Face of those folks and the folks that are with them by about 2 to 1. He ends up being outnumbered by about 10 to 1, and both he and all of his men, he and all of his men are killed in about 15 minutes. So this is a massive victory for the Sioux in that area. Now, they don't win the war overall, but this, that was a good day for them. So, The Dawes Act. So back to that, which is where, I know that's what the question is. So I'll just highlight all the Dawes Act stuff that I put in my notes. Okay, so Dawes Act is 1887. And this is in recognition of the idea that Native American farmers aren't doing it right. They are not farming with their individual families. So what the Dawes Act does is it splits the reservation into individual family plots, 160 acres, because that's what we do. And you can have more if you have kids. I think it's 80 extra acres per kid. And they sell off some of the farmland or some of the reservation land and use that money to build boarding schools where they send kids out of town to go learn. So, and they tend to sell off the best land to local farmers, and that way too, the reservation has immediate neighbors. So that way it's more likely to force the natives to stay on the reservation because they have neighbors and fences and things like that. So the Dawes Act redistributes the farmland into individual family plots and forces the families to farm individually rather than communally. They sell over 2 million of the, when it says best arable acres, those are the acres that are more likely to produce crops. And the boarding school is where you go off and live at the school and learn there as well. We're used to that concept in college. We don't see that as often in the United States for elementary schools or secondary schools, although it does happen. There are boarding schools. But the purpose here, they took the Native American kids away, and the boarding schools tended to be pretty far away. Carlisle was in Pennsylvania, which is the most famous one, and the Haskell School was in Kansas. I know there's a lot of reservations in Oklahoma, and that's not too far away. But they took them away from their families because their families were just teaching them tribal culture. So they wanted to, you want to change the culture, you got to get rid of the buffalo, you have to change the way people make a living, and you have to change the children's education. So at these boarding schools, they were required to dress a certain way, which was not, as Native Americans typically dressed. They had to cut their hair and wear it like the average white guy. They had to go to chapel twice a week where they learned about Christianity. And they also, in their classes, of course, learned English, learned history, government, that sort of stuff, but they also learned about farming. So they learned about, what to plant, how to use the farm equipment, how to fix the farm equipment, when to harvest, that sort of stuff. So they had a agricultural style education, but also a culturally appropriate average white guy education. If they spoke their native language or dressed in ways they weren't supposed to, they got punished. And so they stayed on these reservation schools for a while, probably till they were about 12 or 13, maybe a little older, and then got sent back to the reservation. And the goal was that this generation, who's now educated as an average white farmer, would go back to the Native American tribe and show them, what they were supposed to do. Now, one of the odd things, and you could find this maybe for your book review if you're super interested in it, is at the Carlisle School, they wrote a lot of stuff like poetry and stories and essays and things. And the kids talked a lot about how they were really trapped between two worlds and neither world accepted them. Because whether or not they acted like a white guy, they didn't look like a white guy. Even if their hair was cut that way, I mean, a lot of these guys were darker skinned. They certainly had different facial features. They had accents with their English, most likely. So they weren't accepted by white society. But when they went back to the reservation, they also weren't accepted by tribal society because they had changed. So they talked about how they were trapped between two worlds. And it's really kind of poignant and depressing, as good literature often is. So the end result, and this is the goal, is that they changed tribal culture, really destroyed tribal culture in many ways. And if you're wondering, will there be a point where the U.S. government at some point says, oh, we've made a mistake, we should allow these tribes to govern themselves and have their own schools? Yeah, there's a point at which that happens, and it's in the 1930s. So it's 50 years down the road, and it's probably as much for economic reasons. You probably heard there's a depression in the 1930s as it is for any other reason. So Dawes Act is pretty, now, I don't know how to describe it. It's just such it's a very specific, intentional piece of legislation, the goal of which is changing somebody's culture, which is just a weird reason to write a law, I think, in the modern era in some ways, although, I suppose almost every law we have is to change people's behavior. And, people who wrote this law would say, we're really not just trying to change people's behavior to make them better and safer and that sort of stuff. But, in reflection, we can look at this and say, like, we just said, your culture's wrong and we're changing it. And that looks like something, nobody really in the modern era would think was okay. Although I say that, and countries, still do that, including us. We still do it too. All right. Any questions about the Dawes Act before we move to the ghost dance? I noticed I did not put too much in my notes about the ghost dance, so that's where, one of you asked, are we going to look in the book? Yeah, I would definitely look in the book for ghost dance. Okay. So ghost dance, all I have in here is that it marks the end of organized Native resistance for decades to come. So might as well close that, because it wasn't that helpful anyway, was it? And I'll tell you a little bit about the ghost dance. So ghost dance started by some guy. I don't remember if the book mentions there was some guy. And I can't remember his tribe, but some guy's name is Wovoka. So I'm typing that in there. And he starts the ghost dance. And what happens in the ghost dance is people dance, hence it's a dance, until they have a vision of the buffalo returning and white men leaving. So, what they want is their culture back. And this dance is a reflection of that desire to have their culture restored. So, if in their way of belief, if they have more people doing this dance, they're sending essentially more prayers that this might happen. So this is not necessarily an armed revolt against the US government. It's a bunch of people dancing. But it's a bunch of people dancing essentially in protest of what's happened to their culture. And it'd be like a giant prayer session. Like if I don't know which group, we can pick Christians if you like. If every Christian in the country was mad about something, so they decided to have a big pray-in somewhere. And, not necessarily that they blocked streets or anything, but maybe they went to, I know I live out in Leander, so maybe they all went to Williamson County Regional Park and they all had a big prayer in the soccer fields in the back where no one ever practices or plays. So it doesn't get in anybody's way, but there's a large group of people and it's not during a pandemic, so it's not unsafe, but there's a large group of people and they clearly want something to change. Maybe their prayer is, and I'm not saying this should be their prayer, but their prayer is that Williamson County residents would stop voting for Republicans and start voting for Democrats. So, some sort of politically motivated kind of thing. Not necessarily illegal, but might be irritating to some people. So you got a whole bunch of people praying on all the soccer fields at the back of Williamson County Regional Park that Williamson County people will stop voting for Republicans. And they figure the more they pray, the more God will hear their prayers, and then maybe we'll elect a bunch of Democrats in Williamson County. And so say the Williamson County Sheriff's Office, which is decidedly Republican, decides we don't like that, so we're going to go monitor that prayer session. So this is kind of what happens at Wounded Knee. There's a really large instance of ghost dancers. So there's thousands of them in one spot, and they're doing the dance, and it's you know, it's loud. I mean, there's drums and it's loud, and there's costumes and that kind of stuff. So at some point, there are some people who come in for the dance, and they are either armed or not, depending on whose story you like. And the soldiers who are guarding, patrolling, making sure the thing doesn't get out of hand, try to disarm the guy maybe, and either the gun goes off accidentally, or he shoots at the soldiers, or there was never a gun at all, and they misheard misheard drum beats and thought that it was gunshots. Whatever happens, the soldiers who are surrounding the event shoot into the crowd of dancers. So hundreds of, about 200, I think, people get killed at this event. So this ghost dance at Wounded Knee, and when you talk about this in your question, you know, you definitely want to talk about what it represents, and you know, how it's really kind of a public demonstration of disapproval of what's happened with the Dawes Act and the end of the reservation and destruction of the buffalo, the destruction of their traditional culture. So at Wounded Knee, when nearly 200 people get killed, this is significant because it's the end of organized resistance to the US government for quite a while. Now, in the modern era, 1960s, 70s really, Native American civil rights movement, what you'll end up seeing is there'll be a group of Native Americans who go back and retake Wounded Knee, and that's, you know, historically significant if you know what happened there the first time. So the retaking of Wounded Knee is supposed to be a sign from Native Americans that they're wanting to reclaim their culture. And so this instance, you know, was a very public demonstration of their frustration with the US government at eliminating their culture. And the dance was, you know, ended, the dance at Wounded Knee ended tragically with what it, you know, is fairly called a massacre, for sure. All right, any Wounded Knee questions that you would like to ask, or about the Dawes Act or anything, since your question is, how did things go for Native Americans, you know, since you got the Native American question this week.
So was the ending of Wounded Knee, did it end with the ghost dance? Is that what you were saying?
Wounded Knee was the big, it was thousands of people performing the ghost dance, and it ends with soldiers shooting at the dancers and killing about 180 of them.
Got it. Okay.
So it's significant because it's the last organized resistance in that era to the US government. After that, pretty much everybody just submits and stays on the reservations, and no more demonstrations for a while, a long while, to be fair. All right, you guys have other questions? Thanks for asking that, by the way. All right, I know some of you are thinking I want to leave. I can't believe that. But let me ask really quick. Sorry, but it's attendance, so let me just check. So if you're here and I missed you, is Morgan Allen here? And if you guys see Morgan Allen's name and they don't answer, you could tell me, or you could go like, psh, they should pay attention. Victoria Alvarez. And Isaiah Castilla. I guess my roll taking is okay so far. I think here's where it falls apart. Marco Cervantes. Because there's somebody that just says Marco. That's probably him, right? It's not going to say. I know. This is where if you guys were in class, you could elbow each other. Calvin Coffey. Okay, good job. Calvin Coffey. And Eric Constantino. See, I think that person's never come. Miracle Curry and Corey Griswold. It's tricky because there's like 36 of you, and you don't all, put your full name on there. And I think that was it, because I think the other person came in that was Seja. Sage? Yeah, but she came in. All right. Thanks for that. All right, and we could stop and talk about the politics of this era really quick, or we can add that next time. And, oh, I was only calling the people I hadn't checked off. So, Kennedy, I got you. Yeah. So, if I didn't call your name, it was because I know you're here. The other people, I just got confused. All right. Okay. So, anything you want to ask before we go? All right, I did make you nervous with the roll call thing. I didn't mean to. All right, well, enjoy the cooler weather as you work on your weekly question. Feel free to email me if you have a question. I'm gonna grade some more tomorrow and Saturday probably. So submit stuff if you want to, and I'll try to grade it. And send me emails if you have questions. If you were not here a little earlier, some people ask, can we redo stuff? And it's like, I'd rather you didn't. However, if you didn't get a grade you liked on the first assignment, if you want to send me your draft of the second assignment long before it's due, don't send it, Friday at 8 a.m. next Friday. But if you want to send me a draft of something and say like, hey, how am I doing? I'll give you some feedback, as long as all 100 of my students don't do that on the same day. But that never happens, to be honest, because truthfully, most of you are going to wait till the last minute to submit stuff. Although several of you have already turned stuff in. You have. I'm glad that you had time to do it. And I also completely understand if you don't. As far as submitting the assignments, because somebody asked if a doc or a PDF, I think both of those work. Just don't put it in the comments section. You have to put it in the assignment section. And to be 100% honest with you, I've never submitted, so I don't know what it looks like on your side. But most people, it seems to work. And if for some reason you submit it in a form where I can't read it, I'll just give you a 1. You'll notice that. And then I'll put in the comment, I couldn't read your submission, and then just convert it or something. But if you do it, the doc or PDF, that should work. If there's an issue with it, I'll let you know, but always, 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 always save it. And I think if you write it in, which I think is completely legitimate because those seem to show up, just make sure you save a copy of it. If you do it that way, I think that's fine as well. I would just save it as a document and then paste the text in or something. But always, always, always save it in some form, always. Because, you'll be way more sad than I will if I don't get it, because you'll have to redo it. Yeah. Nobody likes redoing stuff. I had to redo some comments last night, and I was like, dang it. So, yeah. So, I feel your pain a little. Only my comments are shorter than your answers usually. All right, then. I guess we're done for the day. Lovely to see you. Stay behind if you want to ask a question. Take care of yourselves. Go enjoy the cooler weather. Oh, and I'm supposed to stop recording.